If I can get everyone's attention, please. I think now would be a great time for us to start with our first presentation. And if you could all join me in welcoming Diego up, who will be presenting to you Postgres and the web development stack.
Thank you. Well, again, I want to say welcome to everyone here tonight. We have prepared two talks. This one is the introductory one, and this is going to be about 30 minutes. Yes. So I'm a beginner with Postgres. I have been a developer for many years, and now I am associated with the training of Fujitsu's middleware. But with Postgres, this is the first time for me. I had a play with it for a couple of weeks, and I managed to do a few tricks with Ruby and Python. So I wanted to share with you what I found. Initially, I wanted to have a look at the web app development stacks because many years ago, as you probably also have this same experience, we went through different technologies, and from COBOL to C language, and then we went into Visual Basic and ASP, and then Java, C#, and all of these things that came after that. So I'd like to mention some of these technologies that are available there now for web development. Initially, I looked at the LAMP stack that was probably about 10 years ago, and we saw LAMP standing for Linux, Apache, MySQL, and Perl or PHP. At that time, MySQL was popular. Then, in the year 2008, Sun Microsystems bought it, and then in the year 2010, Oracle bought Sun. And I think there's a feeling out there in the community that MySQL is being somehow trapped or locked by the interest of this company, and a lot of people are now turning into Postgres. I don't know if you have that feeling there. Also, back in time, Perl was a very popular language. People used to say that Perl was the tape that hold all of the internet together, docking tape. Yes. PHP became popular later on, comes a slide later on. Java became a popular technology. Some of you probably work with Java still today. We can see that, of course, they favor Oracle with time, because this implied a shift in the way of thinking. You know, we went all the way from mainframe development to PC development to networks. And then when we came to web development, we saw a lot of interesting things happening. A lot of technologies and languages were coming together. We had HTML, XML, we have SQL, we have JavaScript, and a few other things there to play with. And if you look at this early code, it was quite like a spaghetti. I remember writing some code for a bank in the US using ASP, and you look at the page and it was like 3,000, 5,000 lines of code, and it had everything in there, JavaScript, HTML, everything. So there was an attempt to put some order in there. There was an idea of the separation of concerns, and we saw some of those early attempts with struts and with JFS and some of these technologies. Okay. So then we saw the Windows group of people with Microsoft. They use their IS as a web server, the Microsoft SQL Server as a database, and then the ASP, C#, and .NET technologies on top of that. And now looking at open source. Open source was, I found myself very attracted to these technologies because, first of all, they were, for me, free. I didn't have to pay for them. I can throw Windows through the window and start playing with this. I looked at the languages coming up. I particularly favored Ruby. I liked it. I started playing with it and found that I could do a lot of things very quickly. I also saw that Python was not too hard to learn. And at the same time, I started looking into Postgres and perhaps other databases that became popular, what they call the non-SQL databases, like MongoDB. So looking at that, coming back to the PHP stack, PHP is still around. PHP has probably more than 20 million websites out there still running on PHP. Cake PHP, Symfony, were some of the popular frameworks used for that language. And recently, there's Laravel and Falcon. Some of the, if you are using PHP, probably you'll be looking into that. Also, as a consequence of the lock of MySQL, MariaDB came as an open source alternative based on MySQL. Now, if you look at Python, I found it very interesting. Recently, we went to the Python conference here in Brisbane. There was a lot of interest in Django and Flask. So I also had my hands on that and tried to play with them a little bit. I noticed that the Python community is probably divided into two because of the two flavors of the language, of the 2.7 and 3.4. The tendency is to favor the 3.4, but I know there's a lot of things written in 2.7, and some of the technologies still rely on 2.7. Also worth mentioning SQLite, which is another database that people could use there. On the Ruby side, because as I mentioned before, I am a Rubyist. I like Ruby. I started playing with Rails. Rails was a very interesting technology from the beginning, and I noticed that a lot of the frameworks that came later on were actually trying to imitate, in a way, what the good things that Rails had. So we see this reflected in Django and other of the frameworks. So I'm going to mention this a bit later on in detail. I have an example to show you. Okay, so this is Ruby. Ruby was developed by Matsumoto in Japan. I don't know how popular it really is in Australia or in other countries, but in Japan it's very popular. Everyone uses it. Okay. I wanted to mention Lua as another language. I overheard a conversation somewhere here tonight that you guys are using Haskell and Scala, yeah, which is good to hear. Yes. So it's good to mention that we are not restricted to Python and Ruby or PHP. So there are more languages out there, and Lua is one of them. Lua means moon in Portuguese, and it was developed in Brazil. And it's a very small language derived from C. It's very compact, very fast, and a lot of young people are studying Lua in this moment. So I guess maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a lot of development in this area. So there's already some frameworks available for that. Okay, so just keep an eye on Lua. All right. Now, why Postgres? Well, we found that it was an old and well-tested technology, very reliable. There's a lot of plugins for natural language parsing, multidimensional indexing, and other things. I found is coping with the times. Recently, if you look at Postgres, also there is JSON data type format, JSON-B as well. So there's a lot of very interesting things coming out up there for Postgres. Now, I had a play with it, and before that, I thought, okay, what would be the things that around Postgres we would like to see or developed or use that make it more appealing? And I thought perhaps these things like a RESTful API. I know that there's a plugin for that. People would be thinking, of course, always as for authentication, encryption, JSON, as we mentioned before, visualization, because you want to somehow see this data in different formats, graphical formats if possible. And I had a quick play with it. I found these functions that allow me to convert from a select from a table. I get some rows, and then I can easily with row to JSON, array aggregate, and array to JSON functions, I can convert it into JSON format. So I found that was simple enough. Then I found also that I could do something a little bit more complicated and even get a count of the documents or pieces that I'm returning. Okay, that's also simple enough to play with. But also there was JSON-B, and I didn't have a time to play with that because that's more recent. I did this about 2 months ago, and I think this is more recent. And then there's a lot of other functions out there to store pieces of information in JSON-B format and extract it and select pieces of it to navigate through it. So probably we could arrange for some talks on that in the near future. How about Ruby and Postgres? I found that it's very easy to get access to a Postgres database from Ruby. Basically, we just install the PG library. From there, it's very easy to create a connection to a database using the database name, the port, the password, and then execute a query, and you get some results up there. So it's very easy. In less than 10 lines of code, you get some data coming through. But because we wanted to see something done with the web, so I had a play with Sinatra. Sinatra is a framework for Ruby. And all of these frameworks are very similar. They have this separation of concerns. So you have the model view controller architecture. So the controller basically takes care of the routes, the business logic behind the application. The view is basically a way of converting some templates into HTML with data that we pass into them. And the data usually comes from a database, and we have an object model in the language so we can access everything through it. And behind it, we usually have an ORM, or an object relational mapping, a piece of software that does the interaction for us. And this is, in this case, is called active record, okay, which is the same one used by Rails. So that's basically the structure of a Sinatra app. So this is how it looks. You got a controller, basically just a function that takes care of a URL. In this case, I am displaying a form, and then here I'm processing the form and producing a list. Okay. I got a form as a template, and then in this part, I process the data coming from that form. I get the parameters and just pass them into a template so I can fill it in. The data actually comes from, I just create the data object there. The data performs the query. In this case, I'm not using an active record. I'm just accessing the database directly through the PG module. And then I pass it on to the template. So as usual, we have HTML, and we have some code in between to create the dynamic creation of the information, and we get some results when we execute it. So that's very, very simple. It took me just about maybe a couple of hours to play with this. Then I wanted to explore Rails. Rails was a bit more complicated, I found, but much more robust. And also it does a lot of things automatically for you. So I found, for example, when you generate a project in Rails, it creates a lot of code for you. From there, I found a file to do configuration of the database. It's called config database YML, YAML format. There I found that I could put the parameters to access the database, username, password, host, port, database name, and I could have separate ones for development, test, and production. I can generate scaffolds. A scaffold is like a skeleton code that runs for me, does the CRUD functionality, so I have create, read, update, delete functions straight after that. And then I can create migrations. This is basically like a version control for the schemas in the database. So I can build up on different changes that I create on the database, and I can even backtrack and go back to a previous version. So this is nice to have. I run the migration, I run the server, and immediately it has the CRUD functionality out of the box without much code writing. So I had there a list of books, created a book, added it into the list, saw it in the list, and I can even edit it or delete or update. I also have access to the console. The console gives me access to all of the objects in the active record ORM, so I can play with that and learn how to use it. And that's it for Rails. Then I put that aside and said, okay, how about trying this with Python and see what happens? So in Python, I found The language was a little bit different. It takes a little bit of an effort to, I mean, coming from another language, but it was very straightforward. You can learn it quickly. I found that you have to install a module called PsychoPG2. With that, you access the database. It gives you a cursor. Through the cursor, you run a query, and then it gives you some results. Also, with less than 10 lines, you can access a database very quickly. Then I said to myself, okay, now this is time to start looking for the framework. How about Django? So there's plenty of information out there. Django, I found that was very similar to Rails. You had the MVC model view controller architecture. With it, I created a project. The project creates some files for you. Then you create an app. The app is like a subset of the project. So you can have a project could have several apps. From there, there's files for settings. There's a file where you can specify all the settings to access the database. From there, I could create a file for the models and specify my book with title and author, and specify the length. So that was very, very easy to do there. Next, I found that to access, in a way, something similar to what I did in Rails, I had to register the model into the admin. It took me a while to find that out, but then I also found that you can have migrations with Django, very similar to what you do it in Rails. And you also have a shell. And through the shell, you can go in there and play with the model. But I found that the models don't give you back information unless you define this string function in them. So you have to define something a string representation of the object. So, and then I started getting some information back. It was not too difficult. I think we put some effort there. Is very rewarding with these technologies. I find that it's something that we find some books online, some tutorials online, and it's very easy to get started with this. Yeah. So this is just an example. We run the server. This is the admin page. The admin page has already a link to the object, and we have the CRUD functionality out of the box. So we can just we have a list, and we can edit, update, delete records into that table. Then I said, okay, that's Django, that's fine. Now let's look at something else. I said, okay, how about Flask? Flask took me a little while because the books I was reading were a little bit outdated. So it took me a little while to realize that I had to put them aside and just look into the documentation online. And with that one, I managed to get it going. Very similar to Django, except that the model is optional and the ORM is optional, but you can install it as well. These installations are very simple, as you probably know. With Python, just say pip install Flask SQL Alchemy, and off you go. Very easy to do. Then I noticed that it has something called Jinja 2, which is the engine used to do the templates and the renderings. WTF forms, that's also an engine to do validation on the forms and rendering. And then I found, looking into Alchemy, for example, Alchemy is the ORM for Flask. It has 2 entry points, so if you want to do everything high level, you go through the object relational mapper, and you play with objects at that level. If you want a bit more control, you go into the SQL expression language, and you have more you can do there. And down at this level here, DB API, you have the PsychoPG2 library. Okay, so I just created a configuration and loaded it from this object. And that worked. Then I created a model for the book with its own representation. Then I created some routes. And notice that there's also a call to the render template, so I can I can also get the list of books, and if I create a new book, I can append it and into I can iterate over that list and then send it to the template. All right, here I create a new book, and then I add it. I have to use a session to be able to do it. Then I can commit, so this saves it into the database. All right, this is a template for listing the books, and they came out simply. So that's basically what I did in a couple of weeks. So I had this technologies. I'd like to explore more technologies, but at the time, that's what I had, and I wanted to share that with you. So basically, I had a look at that Python, Ruby, the language. PHP is still around. Excuse me if I didn't mention the others, but they are still important. Haskell, Scala, and perhaps Common Lisp or Lua are still languages that are used for the web development. Okay, so we had a look at Rails and Sinatra, Flask and Django, and I noticed that JSON, RESTful interfaces, and perhaps some visualization is something important to have around a database. To conclude, I'd like to say that not everything is about profit and technology. Also, we have to think about tools that are centered around people, around developers, because we want things to be easy to use. The easier it is, the quicker we can pick them up and show it to others. And also asking questions like, how am I making the world better? And what kind of world do we want to build? And finally, also remember open source is a social movement as well as a technology movement. Then I also like to suggest these books. I read before The Cathedral and the Bazaar, the Open Sources, Voices from the Revolution, and the Clue Train Manifesto. I think they're really eye-opening material there, especially this Clue Train Manifesto. If you have not read it, please find it. I think you can get a copy online and have a look. This presentation is going to be available, so you can download it later on together with the video. Also, if you have a chance, listen to the talks by Tim O'Reilly from the US. This an interesting one about the open source paradigm shift there. That's from 2004. Then I have some links to all of these technologies, the web frameworks that I found for the different stacks. Okay, so all of these links are there available for you if you want to have a look. All right, so thank you. That's it.